Imagine a continent systematically plundered, its people enslaved, its cultures decimated. For centuries, Africa has been the victim of historical injustices that continue to resonate today. These are not just events of the past, they are the roots of present-day inequalities, the open wounds of a history largely unacknowledged and unatoned for. How much was stolen? Who carried out the crimes? And where are we today in the pursuit of justice? This story begins in the late 15th century, with the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade. Portuguese ships sailed down the West African coast, initiating a commerce in human lives that would soon engulf the continent. By the 16th century, enslaved Africans were toiling in the mines and plantations of the Americas, their forced labor fueling the rise of European empires. The numbers are staggering. An estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Millions perished during the brutal journey known as the Middle Passage, their bodies thrown overboard, their stories lost to the waves. But the Atlantic slave trade was not the only theater of this tragedy. For centuries, the Indian Ocean had been a conduit for the enslavement of Africans, with captives transported to Arabia, Persia, India, and the islands of the Indian Ocean. Zanzibar, under the rule of Sultan Soyed Said, became a major hub for this trade, its clove plantations fueled by the labor of enslaved East Africans. The 19th century brought a new wave of injustice, colonial conquest. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized the scramble for Africa, as European powers carved up the continent among themselves, drawing arbitrary borders that continue to fuel conflict today. One of the most horrific examples of colonial brutality was the Congo Free State, controlled personally by King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold's insatiable greed for rubber led to a reign of terror, with forced labor, mutilation, and mass murder becoming commonplace. Estimates of the death toll vary, but many scholars believe that as many as 10 million Congolese people perished under Leopold's rule. In German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, the Herero and Nomo people rose up against colonial rule in 1904. The German response was swift and brutal. General Lothar von Trotha issued an extermination order, driving the Herero into the desert, where they were left to starve and die of thirst. An estimated 60,000 Herero and 10,000 Nomo people were killed in what many historians now recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century. But the violence was not confined to outright extermination. Throughout southern Africa, colonial regimes implemented systems of forced labor and racial domination. Pass laws, taxation, and land seizure were used to compel Africans to work for European settlers and mining companies. The Natives Land Act of 1913 restricted African land ownership to a tiny fraction of the country, laying the foundation for the apartheid system that would later enshrine racial segregation into law. Beyond the physical and economic exploitation, colonial powers also engaged in a systematic campaign of cultural plunder. Royal regalia, religious objects, human remains, and ancient manuscripts were looted from African societies and dispersed to museums and private collections around the world. The Benin expedition of 1897 saw British forces sack Benin City, looting thousands of bronze plaques and sculptures that now reside in museums across Europe and North America. Even African knowledge was suppressed. Colonial scholars often dismissed African history as mere legend or unreliable memory, ignoring or destroying written records, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence. The long-term consequences of these historical injustices are profound. Demographic devastation, political fragmentation, economic distortion, and racial ideology continue to shape the lives of Africans today. Many African economies remain dependent on the export of raw commodities, trapped in a cycle of debt and unequal trade. Land dispossession continues to fuel conflict and inequality in many parts of the continent. But there is also a growing movement for reparations, demanding that the former colonial powers acknowledge their guilt and make amends for the harms they have inflicted. Reparations are not just about cash payments. They can also include land restitution, the return of cultural property, debt relief, institutional reform, and educational redress. The African Union has repeatedly called for reparatory justice, linking historical injustices to present-day global inequality and development crisis. Ghana has emerged as a leading voice in this movement, advocating for a new international economic order that is more just and equitable. And across Africa, museums are grappling with the legacy of colonialism, returning looted artifacts and rewriting the narratives of the past. The road to justice is long and arduous, but the pursuit of truth and reconciliation is essential for healing the wounds of history and building a more equitable future for all. The call for reparations is echoing louder than ever before. Will the world finally listen?